The first sign wasn't a ship in the sky or a message from the stars. It was a Toyota Camry, wrapped around a 100-year-old oak tree on the edge of Harmony Creek. Sheriff Dale Cobb got the call just after dawn. He'd been nursing a mug of bitter coffee, watching the morning news argue about politicians he didn't care about. The world was always angry about something. When he got to the crash, the strangeness hit him like a physical blow. The driver, a high school science teacher named Mr. Abernathy, was sitting perfectly upright in his seat. No blood, no visible injuries. His seatbelt was on. The airbag had deployed and deflated, but his hands were still on the wheel, his knuckles white, and his eyes. Dale had seen a lot in 20 years of law enforcement, but he had never seen eyes like that. They were wide open, staring straight ahead, not at the shattered windshield, but through it. At nothing. "Mr. Abernathy," Dale said, tapping on the glass. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. The man didn't even blink. He was breathing, a slow, steady rhythm, but he was gone. It was like the pilot had left the cockpit, but the engines were still running. Deputy Miller, young and green, circled the car, his face pale. "Sheriff, I don't get it," Miller said. "The skid marks go straight. No swerve, no brake. He just drove right into the tree like he was aiming for it." Dale felt a low thrumming sound in his teeth. He thought it was his own nerves, the grinding of jaw that came with a bad accident scene. He told Miller to call for an ambulance, though he wasn't sure what they would do. You couldn't fix a man who wasn't broken, just empty. As the paramedics worked, trying to get a response from the catatonic teacher, Dale heard it again. The hum. It wasn't just in his teeth anymore. It was in the air. A bass note so low you felt it more than you heard it. Like a giant, unseen generator had just been switched on somewhere deep underground. "You hear that?" Dale asked his deputy. Miller cocked his head. "Hear what, Sheriff?" Dale looked around. The birds had stopped singing. The usual morning chatter of the woods was gone. There was only the strange, vibrating silence and the low, persistent hum. On the highway in the distance, he saw a truck slow to a stop for no reason. Then another car behind it. And another. No brake lights, no horns. They just coasted to a halt, one by one, like toys whose batteries had died. Then his radio crackled. It was Donna from dispatch, her voice tight with panic. "Dale, you there? The phones are going crazy. It's happening everywhere. People are just stopping. In the diner, at the gas station. They're just standing there." Dale looked back at Mr. Abernathy, who was now being loaded onto a gurney, his eyes still wide, still staring at that invisible point in the distance. The hum grew louder in Dale's bones. He looked at Miller, who was now staring at his own hands, a look of placid confusion on his face. "Miller?" Dale said, his voice sharp. Miller didn't answer. He slowly, deliberately, put his hands in his pockets and turned his head to the east, just like Abernathy had. His eyes went glassy and vacant. The deputy wasn't there anymore. Dale was alone. He looked at the paramedics. One was frozen mid-stride. The other was staring blankly at the sky. The world wasn't angry anymore. The shouting on the news, the political squabbles, the endless human noise. It had all been a distraction, a waiting room. Dale Cobb looked out at the silent, still world, the cars frozen on the highway, the people standing like statues, and a cold, terrifying thought bloomed in his mind. The arguments hadn't been the story. The division was never the point. It was just the noise we made while we were waiting for this. waiting for the signal to arrive. And now that it was here, the show was about to start. The hum was the only sound in a world that had forgotten how to make noise. Dale stood on the side of Route 2, a lonely figure in a landscape of motionless statues. His own heartbeat hammered in his ears, a frantic drum against the steady, subsonic pulse that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He tried his radio again. Static. He tried his cell phone. No service. He was an island. He walked back to his cruiser. The engine was still running, a small familiar comfort in a world gone sideways. He got in and for a moment just sat there, trying to make sense of the impossible. Across the street, Martha Green, who ran the local bakery, stood on her porch, one hand holding a watering can, staring east. The water had long since run out, but she held the pose, a perfect, unmoving portrait of a morning chore interrupted. Dale drove slowly back toward the center of town. It was worse than he imagined. People were stopped everywhere. A mailman, mid-stride on a lawn, kids on bikes, balanced impossibly, their faces vacant. At the town square, a dozen or so people who had been enjoying the morning sun were now a silent, staring congregation, all facing east. His mind raced, looking for a rational explanation. A gas leak? Some kind of mass hysteria? A sonic weapon, but none of it fit. There was no smell of gas. The silence was the opposite of hysteria. And a weapon implied an enemy, an attack. This didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a switch being flipped. He pulled up to the sheriff's office. Donna, his dispatcher, was at her desk. She was one of them. Her hand was frozen over the radio console, her eyes fixed on the far wall. Dale felt a pang of grief that was sharp and surprising. He'd known her for 30 years. Now she was a shell. He went into his office and locked the door, a completely useless gesture that made him feel marginally better. He turned on the small television in the corner. For a few minutes there was nothing but a test pattern. Then a shaky image appeared, a news anchor in a studio in New York. Her hair was a mess, and she was talking so fast her words tripped over each other. "We have no confirmation," she was saying, her voice strained. "But what we are seeing seems to be global. Reports are coming in from London, Tokyo, Cairo. Footage shows the same thing. People just stopping." Behind her, through the studio window, Dale could see the New York streets. They were clogged with yellow cabs and city buses, all silent, all still. A sea of frozen metal. "Experts are baffled," the anchor continued, her composure cracking. "Some are postulating a neurological event, a previously unknown virus, but the speed, the simultaneity of it. It's... Oh my God," she whispered. "He's just standing there. Carl, can you hear me?" The camera wobbled, then swiveled to show a cameraman, a heavy rig on his shoulder, standing perfectly still, his body aimed at the anchor, but his head turned, his eyes glazed and staring out the window, towards the east. The anchor let out a small, choked sob. The screen went black. Dale sank into his chair, the hum, a constant companion, a roommate in his skull. The world hadn't ended in fire and fury. It had just paused. Humanity, with all its raging debate and passionate hatreds, its art and its wars, had been put on hold. The office phone rang. The sound was so shocking in the profound silence that Dale flinched, knocking over his cold mug of coffee. He stared at the phone as it rang a second time. Who could possibly be calling? He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. "Cobb," he said, his voice hoarse. "They finally did it, Sheriff," a crackly voice said. It was old Man Hemlock, a retired engineer who lived up on the ridge and spent his days talking to people on his ham radio and his nights watching the skies. The town loon. The signal. It's not a sound wave, you know. It's a resonance frequency. Tuned to the iron in our blood, the water in our cells. They've activated the sleeper code. "Hemlock, what are you talking about?" Dale demanded, his patience gone. "I've been warning everyone for years." Hemlock's voice was a mix of terror and vindication. "It's not a weapon, Sheriff. It's a key. They're not turning us off, they're turning us on." Before Dale could ask what he meant, the hum changed. The low, steady thrumming shifted pitch, rising just enough to become an audible, gut-wrenching tone. And outside his window, in the town square, the statues began to move. The movement was not the panicked, jerky return to life Dale might have expected. It was slow, deliberate, and unified. All at once, the people of Harmony Creek lowered their heads as if in prayer. The staring was over. A new phase had begun. Dale stood at his office window, a prisoner watching the inmates of his own town. Martha Green, the baker, set down her watering can with unnatural gentleness. The mailman completed his step, his movements smooth and economical. The kids on their bikes dismounted with a grace they had never possessed in their prior lives. They were all moving, but the silence remained. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. They were a collective, their individual personalities erased, replaced by a single shared purpose. What was that purpose? He watched as people began to walk, not wondering, not confused. They walked with direction. They started to gather things. Mr. Henderson, who owned the hardware store, walked to his shop, unlocked the door, and began carrying out shovels, crowbars, and coils of rope, laying them on the sidewalk in neat piles. Others joined him, forming a silent, efficient line to empty the store of its tools. There was no looting, no chaos. It was organized. It was work. Humanity, the species that couldn't agree on what to have for dinner, was now operating as a single, perfectly coordinated organism. He had to do something. He was the sheriff. It was his job to protect these people, even if they were no longer the people he knew. He unholstered his pistol, then holstered it again. What was he going to do? Shoot them? They weren't attacking. They were busy. He left his office and walked out into the square. The air was thick with a new, higher-pitched hum. It made his teeth ache. He approached a group of people who were dismantling a park bench, their movements synchronized. "Can anyone hear me?" Dale asked, his voice sounding loud and obscene in the quiet. "What are you doing?" They didn't even turn their heads. They worked on, their faces placid, their eyes focused on their task. He put a hand on the shoulder of a man he recognized as a local farmer. The man didn't flinch. He just continued to unscrew a bolt, his muscles moving under Dale's hand, solid and real. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. Dale was a ghost in his own town. He felt a profound, crushing loneliness. He was on the outside looking in. Why him? Why wasn't he like them? Why was he still Dale Cobb, sheriff of Harmony Creek, scared and confused, while everyone else had been absorbed into this silent, purposeful mass? Was he broken? Or were they? He thought of Hemlock's words, a resonance frequency, a sleeper code. It sounded like science fiction nonsense, but what other explanation was there? He looked at the faces of the people he had sworn to protect. They weren't scared. They weren't in pain. The fear was all his. He saw them starting to bring the materials, the tools from the hardware store, the wood from the dismantled benches, metal from street signs they were now taking down. To the center of the square, they were clearing a space. They were preparing to build something. He backed away, retreating to the relative safety of his cruiser. He needed to find someone else who was still themselves. Was Hemlock one of them? He had been on the phone, lucid and terrified. He had to be like Dale, unplugged. As he got into his car, he caught a glimpse of movement in the window of the town library. A flicker of something that was not the slow, methodical rhythm of the others. He looked closer and saw a face peer out from behind a bookshelf before quickly pulling back. It was Sarah, the librarian's daughter, a quiet 15-year-old girl who was always drawing in a sketchbook. And in her eyes, for just a second, he saw something he hadn't seen all day, not since the sun came up. He saw fear. He was not alone. The library door was unlocked. Inside, the silence was different. It wasn't the eerie, purposeful silence of the outside world. It was the familiar, dusty silence of books. Dale moved cautiously through the aisles, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. The hum was fainter in here, muffled by the sheer mass of paper and knowledge surrounding him. He found Sarah huddled in the young adult section, tucked between a row of fantasy novels and a wall. She had her knees pulled up to her chest and a thick sketchbook clutched like a shield. Her eyes were wide, tracking his every move. "It's okay, Sarah," Dale said softly, keeping his distance. "It's me, Sheriff Cobb. I am not like them." The girl didn't relax, but a flicker of understanding crossed her face. "You can hear it too?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The buzzing." "I can feel it," Dale corrected. "In my bones." She nodded, a quick, jerky motion. "They don't hear it. They're part of it. It's like a song, and they're all singing along, but we're out of tune." Dale looked at the sketchbook in her arms. "What have you got there?" Hesitantly, she opened it. The pages were filled with drawings, all done in a frenzied dark pencil. They weren't her usual sketches of flowers and animals. These were strange geometric patterns, interlocking spirals, and towering, impossible structures. And on the last few pages, she had drawn the town square. In her drawing, a massive tower stood where the town fountain used to be. It was a bizarre, organic-looking thing, part machine, part bone, reaching for the sky like a skeletal finger. It was intricate and horrifyingly detailed. "They're building it," Sarah whispered, tracing the drawing with a trembling finger. "Right now. Outside? I saw it in my head before they even started. It's like the song has a blueprint." Dale felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. A 15-year-old girl was drawing the architectural plans for an alien project being built by his zombified neighbors. Nothing in the police academy had prepared him for this. "Why us, Sarah?" he asked, sitting on the floor a few feet away from her. "Why aren't we singing along?" She shook her head, her dark hair falling across her face. "I don't know. Maybe we're defective. My dad always said I was a daydreamer. My mind is always somewhere else. Maybe it was somewhere else when the song started, so it couldn't get in." It was the logic of a child, but it made as much sense as anything else. Dale thought about himself. He was a creature of habit, of routine. But his mind was always churning, replaying old cases, thinking about his late wife, worrying about the town. Maybe his brain was too noisy, too full of its own static, to receive the signal cleanly. They were the perfect quiet radios, and he and Sarah were broken. "We need to find a safe place," Dale said, getting to his feet. "My office is secure for now, but we can't stay in town. We need to find Hemlock." "The crazy radio guy on the ridge?" "He's not crazy," Dale said, a grim certainty in his voice. "He's the only one who had a clue this was coming." He led Sarah to the library's back door. Peeking out, he could see the project in the square was well underway. The foundation was being laid with paving stones pried from the sidewalks. The base of the tower was taking shape. Dozens of people worked in silent unison, a ballet of construction. They moved with an unnatural efficiency. No wasted motion, no arguments, no coffee breaks. It was the most terrifyingly productive thing he had ever seen. As they slipped out the back and began to move through the alleys, keeping to the shadows, Sarah clutched his arm. "Sheriff," she said, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. "It's not just a building." "What is it then?" She looked at the sketch in her book, at the spire that clawed at the paper sky. "It's an antenna," she said. "They're not just building it. They're getting ready to broadcast. Or maybe they're getting ready for a visitor. They're building a welcome mat." The drive up to Hemlock's place on the ridge was a journey through a silent world. They passed farms where tractors sat idle in the middle of fields, their drivers standing motionless beside them, staring east. A herd of cows stood clustered by a fence, their own animal placidity seeming to mimic the humans. Only the wind and the hum seemed alive. Hemlock's house was less a house and more a chaotic nest of technology. A massive radio mast bristled from the roof, guy-wired to surrounding trees. Satellite dishes of various sizes dotted the yard like metallic mushrooms. Wires snaked out of windows and disappeared into the ground. As they got out of the cruiser, the front door flew open. Old Man Hemlock stood there. A wild-eyed figure with a mess of white hair and a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He was thin and wiry, looking like he was powered by nervous energy and caffeine. "Cobb, I knew you'd come," he rasped, lowering the shotgun. "I saw your cruiser on my cameras. And you brought one of the others." He nodded at Sarah, his gaze sharp and analytical. "You are unplugged too, girl." Sarah just nodded, clutching her sketchbook. Come in. The air is thick with it out there," Hemlock said, ushering them inside. The interior of the house was even more chaotic than the outside. Every surface was covered with radios, oscilloscopes, humming computer servers, and tangled masses of wires. A dozen monitors displayed scrolling lines of code, satellite images, and static. The hum was different in here too. It was captured, analyzed, and displayed as a jagged green line on a central oscilloscope. "There it is," Hemlock said, pointing a shaky finger at the screen. "The signal. I've been tracking it for 40 years. It's always been there." A whisper in the background radiation of the universe. But this morning, at 6:17 local time, the amplitude increased by a factor of 10,000. They cranked up the volume. "They? Who is they?" Dale asked, stepping over a pile of electronics manuals. "The Shepherds," Hemlock said, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a man who has been proven right after a lifetime of being called crazy. "That's what I call them. We're their flock, Sheriff. Humanity. They planted us here eons ago. They cultivated us." He grabbed a worn textbook from a shelf. "It's all in our biology. Junk DNA, they call it. It's not junk. It's a receiver. A set of instructions lying dormant. We thought our divisions, our countries, our religions, our politics were so important, They were just fences, ways to keep the sheep in their pens until it was time for shearing. Sarah, who had been quiet, stepped forward. She opened her sketchbook to the drawing of the tower. "They're building this," she said. Hemlock peered at the drawing, his frantic energy focusing into a sharp point. He let out a low whistle. Of course. Of course. It's not a welcome mat, girl. It's a focusing array. A transponder. The signal activated the flock. Now the flock has to signal back. They have to open the gate for the shepherds to come through. Dale felt the floor drop out from under him. This wasn't an invasion. It was an appointment. A cosmic checkup. So what happens when they get here? To move them to a new pasture or to take them to the slaughterhouse. And I don't see any new pastures around here. He turned back to his equipment, his fingers flying across a keyboard. He brought up a satellite map of the world. Red dots began to appear on it. First one in their own town square, then another in Portland. Then Boston, New York, and on, spreading across the continent like a disease. "It's happening everywhere," Hemlock whispered, his voice trembling. "Every city, every town, every village, they're all building them. The same tower, the same design." He zoomed out the map, and the red dots multiplied, blooming across North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa. A planetary rash, a world united in a single terrifying purpose. "Humanity isn't divided anymore, Sheriff," Hemlock said, looking at the screen, at the planet, covered in glowing red sores. "We're a factory, and the production line just started." The next few hours in Hemlock's fortress of paranoia were a blur of information and dread. Hemlock frantically worked his machines, pulling grainy satellite feeds and tapping into the last vestiges of the automated global news network. The story was the same everywhere. In Times Square, the glowing billboards that once advertised soft drinks and Broadway shows were dark. In the street below, a silent army worked, dismantling the tourist bleachers and scaffolding, their movements as synchronized as the rockets who had once danced nearby. They were laying the foundation for a tower that would dwarf the surrounding skyscrapers. In the Red Square in Moscow, the stones of the famous plaza were being pried up. The people moved with the same eerie calm, their faces blank slates in the cold Russian air. They were building. In a small village, deep in the Amazon rainforest, tribesmen who had never seen a city were working alongside loggers they had been fighting with for generations. They used vines and felled trees, but the structure they were erecting was unmistakably the same design Sarah had drawn. Part organic, part architectural, a spire of primal purpose. "The blueprint is universal," Hemlock muttered, pointing at 3 different screens, showing 3 different continents. "It's embedded in the signal itself. They're not thinking about how to build it. They just know. It's instinct, like a spider spinning a web." Dale watched, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. The scale of it was impossible to comprehend. Every conflict, every border, every language barrier on the planet had been erased in an instant. The great human project, it turned out, was not peace or progress. It was this, building these monstrous spires. Sarah sat at a small table, her sketchbook open. She wasn't drawing anymore. She was just watching the screens, her young face old with a terrible understanding. "They all look so calm," she said quietly. "They're not scared." "You can't be scared when you are not you anymore," Dale said. He thought of Deputy Miller, of Donna at the dispatch desk. Were they still in there somewhere, trapped behind those placid eyes? Or had they been completely overwritten like a file on a computer? The thought was more terrifying than any monster. "T here is something else," Hemlock said, his voice grim. He pointed to a world map, covered in the red dots of the construction sites. "I am running a diagnostic, cross-referencing census data with inactive cell signals and emergency service blackouts. I'm trying to get a count." "A count of what?" Dale asked. "The unplugged," Hemlock said. "Us. The glitches in the system." He typed a final command, and the computer whirred. "It's about 1 in every 10,000, Hemlock said, his voice barely a whisper. "Give or take. A statistical anomaly. A rounding error. On a planet of 8 billion people, that's maybe 800,000 of us. Scattered. Alone. 800,000 individuals left on a planet of 8 billion silent workers." Dale felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He had felt alone in his office in Harmony Creek. Now he felt a cosmic solitude that was 1,000 times worse. They were the last sparks of individuality in a world that had become a single, vast machine. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Why are we different?" "Random chance," Hemlock said, shrugging, though his eyes showed he didn't fully believe it. "A genetic quirk. A cosmic ray that flipped a switch in our ancestors' DNA. Maybe we're immune. Or maybe," he added, a darker thought creeping into his voice, "we're just defective. The part of the crop that isn't fit for harvest. The weeds in the garden." Dale looked out the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley. Down in Harmony Creek, the tower would be taller now. He could almost feel the rhythmic, silent work continuing in the twilight. They wouldn't stop for the dark. They wouldn't stop for anything. The hum was still there, a constant companion. But now Dale understood. It wasn't an attack. It was a roll call, a factory whistle signaling the start of a shift, and 8 billion workers had just clocked in. He, Sarah, and a handful of others, scattered across the globe, were the ones who had slept through the alarm. The last vestiges of a humanity that, until this morning, had thought it was in charge of its own destiny. As night fell, a new and terrible beauty emerged. From Hemlock's vantage point on the ridge, they could see the tower in Harmony Creek begin to glow. It wasn't lit by floodlights. The light came from within the structure itself. A soft, pulsating bioluminescence, cycling through shades of blue and violet. It was mesmerizing and deeply unnatural. Hemlock's satellite feed showed the same phenomenon happening globally. A network of glowing spires now dotted the dark side of the Earth. A man-made constellation of alien purpose. The cities that had once been brilliant webs of electric light were now dark, save for these single, throbbing pillars of strange color. "They're powering up," Hemlock said, his face illuminated by the glow of his monitors. "The structures must be nearing completion. They're drawing energy directly from the environment. Geothermal, ambient radiation. I don't know. The physics is beyond me." For the first time, a profound sense of helplessness settled over Dale. As a sheriff, his entire life was built on action. See a problem, find a solution. Stop the bad guy, help the victim. But how do you stop this? You couldn't arrest a resonance frequency. You couldn't negotiate with a biological imperative. He was a man with a gun in a world where guns no longer mattered. "There has to be something we can do," Dale said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We can't just sit here and watch." "Do what, Sheriff?" Hemlock shot back, his voice frayed. Charge down there and ask them to stop. They won't even see you. They're on a different plane of existence now. We're ghosts to them. The world belongs to the hum.
Then we have to find the others, Dale insisted.
The other, unplugged. 800,000 people. We're not completely alone.
Hemlock sighed a weary, defeated sound. He pulled up a communications map.
I've been trying. The internet is gone.
The phone lines are dead. All that's left is shortwave and ham radio.
And it's mostly silence. A few panicked voices here and there, but they're fading. They're isolated, confused. Some of them probably think they're the only person left in the world. He managed to tune into a crackling broadcast. A man's voice, speaking in French, frantic and scared. Then it was cut off by a burst of static. Then another voice, from somewhere in the Midwest, a woman crying and asking if anyone was out there. Then silence again. It was a chorus of the lost. Dale felt like he was adrift in a vast, dark ocean, and these faint signals were the cries of other drowning souls. Too far away to reach. The loneliness was a physical weight. He looked at Sarah. The girl was asleep, curled up in an old armchair, her sketchbook on her lap. In sleep, her face was just a kid's face, peaceful and innocent. A brutal contrast to the glowing alien tower they could see through the window. He felt a surge of protective anger. Whatever this was, she didn't deserve it. None of them did.
T here is a pattern to the unaffected, Hemlock said, breaking the quiet.
He'd been staring at a screen full of data. It's not entirely random. The incidence rate is higher in people with certain neurological conditions. Epilepsy, severe autism, schizophrenia, and creative savants. He glanced over at the sleeping Sarah, people whose brains are wired differently to begin with. The receivers are already tuned to a different station, so to speak. And then there are people like you and me.
What about us? Dale asked.
I can only guess, Hemlock said. For me, maybe my obsession with this signal, my constant exposure to weird frequencies. It shielded me, desensitized me. For you, who knows? Maybe you are just stubborn, he said with a weak smile. Maybe your brain is just too damn thick to be reprogrammed. The joke fell flat. They were anomalies, errors. The ones the system couldn't process. And in a world of perfect silent unity, the errors were the ones who were truly alone. They were the last individuals. And Dale was starting to realize that individuality, the thing humanity had cherished and fought for, was now a curse. It was the burden of being able to see the bars of the cage. The light from the tower in the valley pulsed, a steady, rhythmic beat. It was like a giant heart. The hum in Dale's bones seemed to synchronize with it. He had a terrible feeling that this was a countdown. The end of the beginning. The towers were built, the power was on. The next stage was coming. And they, the leftovers of humanity, were just spectators, waiting for the curtain to rise on a show that was never meant for them. The dawn of the second day was not like any dawn that had come before. The sun rose into a sky that was no longer just blue. A faint, pearlescent shimmer hung in the upper atmosphere, a residue of the tower's nightly glow. The hum had changed again. The deep, bone-rattling bass was still there, but now it was overlaid with a high, whistling carrier wave, something that felt sharp and crystalline in Dale's sinuses. It's the final phase, Hemlock announced, his face pale and unshaven. He hadn't slept. His eyes were glued to his instruments. The array is active. The gate is opening. On the screens, the world was a study in stillness and anticipation. The silent workers, their construction complete, now stood in organized ranks around the bases of the towers. They were no longer facing east. They were all facing the glowing spires, their heads tilted slightly upwards, like a congregation waiting for a sermon. In Harmony Creek, the people stood in the square, in the streets, on the lawns. Dale could see them from the window, tiny figures in the distance, patient and ready. "What are they waiting for?" Sarah asked. She was awake now, standing beside Dale, her fear having settled into a kind of grim watchfulness. "The shepherds," Dale said, the name feeling less like a conspiracy theory and more like a simple fact. Hemlock shook his head, pointing at a complex graph on his main monitor. "Not exactly. The towers aren't just a gate. They're a bridge. They're creating a stable resonance cascade, a pathway. The shepherds aren't coming here in a ship. They're not going to land on the White House lawn. They're going to merge." The concept was too vast, too alien for Dale to grasp fully. Merge? "The signal reprogrammed the flock," Hemlock explained, his voice low and urgent. "The towers are now connecting the flock to the shepherds. It's not an arrival. It's an absorption. A harvest of consciousness. A harvest." The word sent a shiver down Dale's spine. It brought back Hemlock's analogy of the sheep and the slaughterhouse. He felt a desperate, primal urge to act, to do something. This couldn't be the end. He was a survivor. He looked at Sarah, at her defiant, frightened face. He looked at Hemlock, who had dedicated his life to warning a world that wouldn't listen. They were the resistance, as small and insignificant as they might be. "Hemlock, is there any way to disrupt it?" Dale asked. "To break the signal?" Hemlock stared at him. Then a strange wild light sparked in his eyes. "Disrupt the network. The energy required would be immense. You'd have to create a counter-frequency, a powerful electromagnetic pulse, aimed directly at the focusing crystal at the apex of the tower." "Can we do that?" Hemlock looked around his chaotic laboratory at the cobbled together arrays and humming servers. "My equipment. Number this is a listening post. It's a radio, not a cannon. To generate that kind of pulse, you'd need a massive uncontrolled energy release, a lightning strike, or..." His eyes drifted to a schematic on his wall. A diagram of the town's backup power generator, located in the basement of the town hall, right next to the square. "Or what?" Dale pressed. "The town generator runs on diesel," Hemlock said, thinking aloud. "If you could bypass the safety regulators, overload the capacitors, and channel the entire energy discharge through a focused conduit, like, say, the old copper plumbing in the town hall, you could theoretically create a localized but massive EMP. It would be crude, a sledgehammer to their scalpel. It would fry every piece of electronics in a half-mile radius, including us up here." He gestured to his own equipment. "And it would have to be timed perfectly to hit the tower at the peak of its energy cycle." It was a crazy, long-shot plan. A suicide mission, maybe. But it was a plan. It was something to do other than wait for the end. "How would we know when the peak is?" Dale asked. Sarah stepped forward, her hand on her sketchbook. "I'll know," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "The song. It's getting louder. It's building to a crescendo. I can feel it." Dale looked from the determined girl to the mad scientist. It was all he had. An artist who could feel the alien rhythm, and an engineer who knew how to blow things up. This was the army of human individuality. "All right," Dale said, a new resolve hardening his voice. He picked up the shotgun Hemlock had left by the door. Let's go to town hall. It's time to make some noise. Getting to the town hall was like walking through a dream. The silent people of Harmony Creek stood in their ranks, unmoving. They did not see the sheriff, the old man, and the young girl creeping through the alleys and backyards. It was like they were made of stone. The only movement was the slow, hypnotic pulse of the tower's light, which painted the world in shifting shades of blue and purple. The hum was a physical pressure now. It made Dale's teeth vibrate and his vision swim at the edges. Sarah walked with one hand pressed to her temple, her face a mask of concentration. "It's getting close," she would whisper every few minutes. "The song is almost at the end." Town Hall was a stately old brick building, its windows dark. The basement entrance was around back, a heavy steel door locked with a thick padlock. Dale shot it off with the shotgun. The blast was deafening in the silence, a violation of the world's new, holy quiet. But none of the silent figures turned. They remained fixed on the tower. They were beyond sound now. The basement was damp and smelled of dust and ozone. In the center of the room sat the town's emergency generator, a massive block of green-painted metal. It was an old, reliable beast, built to keep the lights on during Maine's brutal winter storms. Now it was their last, best hope. While Hemlock began frantically working, his gnarled fingers flying as he ripped open service panels and consulted a crumpled schematic, Dale stood guard at the door. He watched the tower. The light was pulsing faster now, the rhythm accelerating. A deep, resonant tone began to emanate from it, the first real sound it had made. It was the sound of a vast machine spooling up. "It's pulling in incredible amounts of energy," Hemlock grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "The air itself is crackling. I am bypassing the governors, rerouting the primary output. This is going to be one hell of a bang, Sheriff." Dale looked at Sarah. She was standing near the generator, her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly, as if to a silent music. "Sarah, you have to tell us when," he said. "Exactly when." She nodded without opening her eyes. "It's a chorus. They're all singing the same note now. All of them, all over the world. They're holding it, waiting for the final beat." Minutes stretched into an eternity. Hemlock finished his work, connecting a thick bundle of cables to a massive copper water pipe that ran up into the ceiling. "That's the best I can do for a makeshift antenna," he said, wiping his greasy hands on his pants. "When I flip this switch, the generator will redline. We'll have maybe 10 seconds before it blows itself apart. That's your window." Dale's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked out the small basement window at the crowd. They were starting to stir. A low chant was rising from them, a single monosyllabic sound that matched the tone of the tower. "Oh, Om, oh." It was the sound of 8 billion voices, all speaking as one. "It's time," Sarah screamed, her eyes snapping open. "Now! The final note is coming now." At the same instant, the light from the tower flared, becoming a blinding column of white that shot straight up into the shimmering, pearlescent sky. The hum reached an unbearable, piercing crescendo. "Flip it!" Dale roared. Hemlock slammed his hand down on a crude knife switch he had wired into the panel. The generator screamed, a shriek of tortured metal that was 1,000 times louder than the shotgun blast. The lights in the basement flickered, flared, and exploded. A wave of pure heat washed over them. Dale saw a brilliant blue arc of electricity leap from the generator to the copper pipe. The pipe glowed red, then white in an instant. For a split second, the world turned into a silent white photograph. And then the sound stopped. The hum, the chant, the piercing whine of the tower. It all vanished. The sudden absolute silence was more shocking than the noise had been. Dale. His ears ringing, staggered to the window. The brilliant white beam from the tower was gone. The structure itself was dark, inert, and the people of Harmony Creek were slumping to the ground. Not like statues, but like puppets whose strings had been cut. They fell in heaps, unconscious. It had worked. They had cut the cord. But as Dale looked up at the sky, a new horror dawned. The pearlescent shimmer in the atmosphere was not fading. It was coalescing. The gate had been opened, even if just for a second, and something had slipped through. It wasn't a fleet of ships. It was worse. The sky itself seemed to be looking back at them. Vast, geometric patterns of light like the circuits of a god were unfolding across the heavens. Immense, silent, and utterly indifferent. They hadn't stopped the shepherds from arriving. They had just cut them off from their flock. Then Sarah spoke, her voice filled with a hollow awe that chilled Dale to the bone. She had seen it, in that final moment of connection before the signal broke. She knew what they were. "They're not shepherds," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the impossible geometry in the sky. "They're not farmers." "What are they, Sarah?" Dale asked, his hand trembling. "We weren't a crop to be harvested," she said, a single tear tracing a path down her dusty cheek. "We were just the tools. We were the biological machines they used to build their bridge. They didn't want our minds. They wanted our hands. And now they're here, and they don't need us anymore." The shepherds had arrived. And humanity, both the silent and the few who were left awake, had just been made obsolete. The silence that followed was the silence of a finished thing. The shepherds, if that's what they were, remained in the sky. Vast shifting constellations of light that defied geometry and reason. They didn't move or attack. They simply were. A silent, terrifying new ceiling on the world. Bun below, humanity began to wake up. Dale, Hemlock, and Sarah watched from the shattered basement of the town hall as the first person stirred. It was Mr. Abernathy, the science teacher who had started it all. He sat up from the pile of bodies in the square, blinking, a thin trickle of blood coming from his nose. He looked at his hands, then at the dark, silent tower, then at the impossible sky. A look of profound, soul-shattering confusion crossed his face. All over town, people were waking up. They were themselves again. The song was gone from their minds. They were individuals, and they were terrified. The quiet awakening quickly turned into a cacophony of screams, cries, and bewildered shouts. People looked at their dirty clothes, their blistered hands, and the monstrous black spire in the center of their town, with no memory of how any of it had happened. They only knew the before and the now. The time in between was a perfect, horrifying blank. "We did it," Hemlock said, though his voice held no triumph. "We gave them back their minds." "And what a world to wake up to," Dale muttered, looking at the celestial beings hanging over them. They emerged into the chaos. People were running, searching for loved ones, staring in horror at the sky. They saw Dale in his sheriff's uniform and ran to him, desperate for answers he didn't have. "Sheriff, what happened? What is that thing?" a woman cried, pointing at the tower. "What's in the sky?" a man shouted, his face white with fear. Dale had no answers. He could only try to impose a semblance of order on a world whose rules had been fundamentally rewritten. He was just a small-town sheriff again, but his jurisdiction now included an alien artifact and gods in the heavens. The days that followed were a global awakening into a new, terrifying reality. The towers stood inert in every city and town, monuments to a purpose nobody could remember. And the shepherds remained overhead, a constant, silent reminder of humanity's true place in the cosmos. There was no invasion, there was no war. The shepherds showed no interest in the waking, terrified humans below. They seemed to be observing, or perhaps they were simply waiting. The world's old divisions began to re-emerge, but they were different now. The arguments weren't about borders or politics anymore. They were about the towers. Should they be torn down, studied, worshipped? And what about the silent gods above? Were they saviors or jailers? Dale, Hemlock, and Sarah became unwilling prophets. Their story was unbelievable, but they were the only ones with any memory of the in-between time. They were the only ones who knew that humanity hadn't been conquered. It had been used. The world was no longer divided by nation or creed. It was divided into two new groups. There were those who looked at the sky with fear, who saw the shepherds as a threat. And there were those who looked up with a strange, hollow longing, a phantom limb of an emotion, a memory of the perfect, blissful unity of the song. They began to gather around the towers, staring at them, waiting for the music to start again. Dale stood on the ridge with Hemlock and Sarah one evening, a month later, looking down at Harmony Creek. The town was lit with campfires and portable generators. Half the townspeople were trying to form committees to dismantle the tower. The other half were holding a silent vigil at its base. Humanity was divided again. It was what they knew best. "You know," Hemlock said, his voice quiet, "maybe we were wrong. Maybe the signal wasn't the end. Maybe it was a test." "A test of what?" Sarah asked. "A test of unity," Hemlock replied, watching the two factions below. "One we passed when we were under their control, and one we are failing spectacularly now that we're on our own again." Dale looked up at the shepherds, the silent geometric lights that had become as familiar as the moon. He thought about the world before, the angry, shouting world on the news. He thought about the silent, purposeful world under the hum. And he looked at the confused, frightened, divided world of today. They thought humanity was divided, and they were right. The unity had been a lie, a temporary state of being, like a tool being picked up to perform a task. Now the task was done and the tool had been put down. The division, the chaos, the fear, that was humanity's natural state. That was the real signal we sent out into the universe. The shepherds weren't waiting for a signal from us anymore. They had what they came for. Now, we were all just waiting for their next move. And this time, we would be awake to see it. Dale wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. He just knew the silence from the sky was the loudest sound he had ever heard.